Welcome to the Xinjiang Journey podcast, part 1. I'm Asia-Pacific Defence Reporter Editor Kim Bergman, and this is the first of two somewhat experimental podcasts. I was in China's remote Xinjiang autonomous region for 8 days in mid-September, and thought sharing the experience might be interesting for some readers. However, this isn't like my normal defence and security podcasts because we didn't see any military hardware or visit any armaments factories. This isn't to say that there wasn't a security dimension, and I've covered some of those in an article in the October edition of the magazine and also mentioned them in a couple of the regular podcasts. However, the overall media program was quite varied, and this is something of a test to see if people have any interest in broader information about Xinjiang, and to a lesser extent how that reflects on China. So, let's start with some of the basics. The tour had the title, The Silk Road Economic Belt Joint Construction Countries Media Head Seminar. And I hope that sounds more elegant in Mandarin than it does in English. There were a total of 32 journalists, of whom 23 were from the international media, and they included, shall we say, classic reporters such as myself, and also some representatives of government news agencies and freelancers with a security orientation. I was the only Australian. The countries were, reading from my list, Albania, Denmark, Germany, Russia, Sweden, Spain, Canada, Australia, Pakistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Uzbekistan, Angola, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Guinea-Bissau, Malawi, and Somalia. There were also 9 journalists from China, some of whom were from the local Xinjiang region. The overall group was considerably larger than that, with a number of interpreters. We had 2 English interpreters, another for Arabic, another for Turkish, then Russian, then French. Our 2 English language interpreters, their anglicised names, Eric and Robert, were professors of linguistics at 2 top Xinjiang universities, and some of the support staff, such as my assistant Lenny, were among their best and brightest postgrad students. And with extra administrative staff, it meant that the tour group was a bit over 40, meaning that ground transport was in 2 buses. And to be clear at the very outset, there were no political lectures and no pressure to write stories in a particular way, or in fact, to write them at all. The overall balance could have been a bit better, slightly shorter lectures and longer periods for Q&As, that sort of thing, but the overall balance was still pretty good. And by the way, at the end of the tour, a number of us made some suggestions to the organisers in the hope that will flow through to future media events, and I suspect that most of the decisions about these sorts of things are made back in Beijing, and the locals on the ground simply have to follow to the plan that has already been decided on. There was nothing at all about the thoughts of President Xi, though a book about that was discreetly left on my coffee table in my hotel room in Kashgar, the second city that we visited. The subject of Taiwan did not come up, except by me, on a couple of occasions when I suggested, as I have done previously, China should instead concentrate on the return of Manchuria and Siberia, currently occupied by Russia, and these ideas were greeted with polite smiles, but also, I have to say, a recognition that the points I was making were historically valid. Most of our questions were answered, but there were some areas where clearly no one wanted to go into a huge amount of detail, probably the touchiest being the full extent of the security crackdowns that occurred in 2014 and 2017. These were focused on Islamic extremists within the Uyghur community. And I'll come back to those later in the podcast, especially in the second part. and hopefully people will still be listening. As regular listeners and readers know, I am not an apologist for China. I've dealt with that previously, and there are many aspects of China's behavior that trouble me. But I also recognize the huge achievements the country has made, particularly on the economic front, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, with more work still to be done. I believe that to understand why countries behave in the way they do, you really have to understand their history, and that is particularly true for China. To make sense of the way China is today and the way that the country's leadership behaves, you have to go back to at least the Opium Wars and the Taiping Rebellion, possibly the most destructive war in human history, in the mid-19th century. Following that, there were other significant events, such as the First Sino-Japanese War, the end of the emperors in 1911, Lordism, civil war, the truly awful Second Sino-Japanese War, better known to us as the Second World War, then 1949 and the Communist victory, the twin disasters of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. If people can put all of that together, in my opinion, they will start to get a glimmering of where we are today. Depressingly, many of my colleagues in the Australian media don't do any research whatsoever. If I had to make a guess, I was invited because of my interest in Chinese history, and that was reflected back to me at a midway point of the tour when one of the organisers said, in a private comment, that it was nice that I knew something about Chinese history because they assumed that no one outside China cared a bit. Anyway, let's begin. I flew from Canberra to Urumqi, economy class, via Melbourne, then an overnight flight to Beijing. A not particularly comfortable experience, I'd have to say, arriving in the capital of Xinjiang late in the afternoon of Monday, September the 8th. Now, as most people would appreciate, China is huge. It's slightly larger than continental Australia, and Xinjiang is in the far west. Flying from the capital of China, Beijing, to the capital of Xinjiang, Urumqi, takes about 4.5 hours, which is about the same time as the Canberra to Perth flight. And just like that flight, rather than watching Dumb and Dumber 7 or The Farmer Wants a New Wife, you can instead stare out the window, as I like to do, looking at nothing at all for most of the flight, and also checking the moving map display. And as you track across China, the vast inhabited desert regions, there's Mongolia to the north and inhospitable Tibet to the south. Urumqi itself, originally a Silk Road oasis town, is a geographic basin surrounded by mountains. First impressions, ultra-modern airport, which was indeed opened only in April. It's a modern city of 44 million or so people and growing. The majority are Han Chinese, the ethnic Uyghur people located generally further in the south. So the 40-minute trip to the hotel from the airport was on freeways and in heavy traffic. Anyone hoping to see Bactrian camels and mud brick houses would be very disappointed because it's a modern city. The hotel was big, and like all the ones we stayed in, it was a government-owned facility with large, comfortable rooms. But here I need to explain for Australian listeners that this was some sort of luxury holiday. It was not. These are no-frills working hotels. There is no bar. There is no a la carte restaurant. There is no room service. What you get for every meal is a large, good quality buffet, and that's more than enough for busy working travellers. There is no alcohol unless you wander out under your own steam and find a convenience store, as I did on my first night. This is relevant to give you a feel for the place. And after my buffet dinner, I decided to orient myself completely unsupervised, I might add. Just wandered out the hotel door. I'd had a look on Google Maps, so I had a rough idea of where I was going. And on finding a shop a few hundred metres away, decided to buy some snacks, and I have to admit, a couple of cans of beer, and straight away encountered a problem of how to pay because China has gone cashless. Don't believe the BS you're told about taking wads of currency. That's not going to help. In Beijing, some places accept Western credit cards, but in Xinjiang and beyond, forget it. You have to connect your Western credit card through Wexi, the financial arm of WeChat, or Alipay, another online purchasing service. And once you've done that, and you have your unique code, you are fine wherever you go. Anyway, on that night, because I hadn't done that, I had no way of paying, and to the obvious anger and frustration of the woman behind the counter, nothing would work. And by the look of the place, my purchase would have been her only sale for the entire evening, so I can fully understand her resentment. Now, next morning started with an introduction to the tour, which I missed because I had to take a phone call, and then onwards to a visit to the Museum of Xinjiang. This was a real rush, and we didn't have much time to linger, unfortunately, but it was part of what I would call the twin themes of the tour: the treatment of Uyghur people, and at the same time connected with progress on the huge Belt and Road Economic Initiative. After the pretty quick museum tour, we were given a lecture about the history of the region, which seemed, again, having done a little bit of research, pretty fair and balanced. It included some facts like Xinjiang in the year 1006 converted to Islam. Some towns were a little bit earlier. It wasn't an overnight process. I think it was, in fact, Urumqi itself that converted on that date, and that ended about 1,000 years of Buddhism. And other religions had also coexisted since ancient times. The whole area was has been a crossroad going back many thousands of years before the time of Alexander the Great. And so what you have at the moment is the Muslim Uyghurs make up about 45% of the population of about 27 million overall. Han Chinese, who have no religion, certainly no official religion, they may make up another 45%. But then you have still some Buddhists, you have some Christians, some Nestorians still lodged there somewhere. So it's a real melting point. And in amongst the ethnic groups, as I say, Uyghurs, Han Chinese make up the bulk of it, but there are Mongols, Kazakhs, people of a distinctly Turkish background, all of that sort of stuff. Now, there have been, of course, times of tension. That is inevitable, I think, in most countries where you have different ethnic and religious groups mixing. But overall, this pattern of coexistence has been the norm for quite a long time. After a quick buffet lunch back at the hotel, and that was a typical pattern, morning meetings back to the hotel to eat, if you're lucky, a little bit of time to check emails, and then the afternoon had two major elements to it. Firstly was a visit to an Islamic institute. This was a place, again, I mentioned it in my article, that trains future imams. It has had about 1,000 students pass through it to date, and every year it has about 150 young men on site. The Muslim Uyghurs are 99% Sunni, for people who are following these things closely, and it didn't take a lot of effort on the part of the organisers to help us reach the conclusion. If it was true that the central government was running a sort of anti-Islam, anti-Uyghur campaign, as it has been frequently suggested, then they wouldn't be bothering, they wouldn't be encouraging young men and paying for them to go to these sorts of Islamic schools. And the one in Urumqi was not the only one. There are numerous Islamic schools throughout Xinjiang. That was followed by a visit moving from the spiritual to the practical to a very modern car factory. This is the GAC Automotive Group, which specializes in hybrids and also has some self-drive vehicles, and this was related very much to the Belt and Road Initiative because the factory had been established in 2016 and started producing cars in 2018. And the attraction of the location in the far west of China is that it is able to have vehicles transported to Central Asia and further to Europe as the Belt and Road Transport Initiative continues to develop. This will be, well, existing and expanded railways and expressways that are predominantly running from east to west. Back to the hotel, fairly late finish. Early morning start. We went to basically a shop selling cashmere wool garments. That was interesting for some people. Then back to the hotel. Then a really interesting part of it, a lecture and discussion. This is particularly relevant for journalists, entitled Cognitive Warfare or Journalistic Practice, Information Manipulation on Xinjiang Issues by, capital letters, some countries. Now, this was a case of China pushing back at some Western TV programs and some Western publications, including one by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute that had made a number of accusations, charges about China's mistreatment of the Uyghurs. Now, the only way that you would actually ever be able to resolve this is to get the people who did the original reporting in the same room as the Chinese people who had done the analysis and said, this was wrong and this was wrong. I'd have to say that I found some of the Chinese analysis to be pretty thought-provoking, and perhaps the best example is that at one point the lecturer put up a picture of supposedly a secret police unit in Urumqi that was responsible for various bad behavior towards Uyghur people. And he pointed to one face amongst the police who indeed looked vaguely familiar, and it was the very famous Hong Kong-based actor Chow Yun-fat, star of fantastic movies such as The Replacement Killers. So clearly that part of it was bogus. So just a bit of food for thought there. Don't necessarily believe everything you read. I say that as a journalist. I make mistakes. We then went to a cotton production plant. It was originally developed in conjunction with a Swiss company by the name of Sauer, S-A-U-E-R, which can trace its origins back to the late 19th century, and it specializes in highly automated machinery for the production of cotton. Very interesting, and I think it was there to push back against, again, these unfounded accusations that Uyghurs are being used as slave laborers. If the whole process is automated, you don't need slave laborers, honestly. I'm rushing through this because the final major event for that day was visiting a huge factory, the China Railway Construction Corporation, which specialized in building tunnel machines for subway systems, including the one in Urumqi, but also huge agricultural machinery, harvesters, headers, all of that sort of stuff that I barely understand. And this factory was gigantic. I've been in some pretty big factories. And putting on my defense hat, I couldn't help but think for a moment, my goodness, if China was ever in a conflict and switched from the production of agricultural machinery to military vehicles, this plant, and I'm sure dozens, if not hundreds, of similar facilities throughout China would be able to produce so much so quickly. Okay, quick dinner, then we headed for the airport for the flight to Kashgar. And I will say that the security at the airport was the strictest that I have ever seen, in a very polite and professional way. And when I commented on that to the organisers, they said we would all find out why by the end of the tour, as indeed proved to be that case. If you're interested, I will commence podcast 2 from when we arrived in Kashgar. Thank you very much for listening.